thank you very much for being here this evening for our first event of the year, and at the rate things seem to be going, might be our last event of the year, because when's the next time we can get this many people in one room together? So nobody shake hands. Just, if anybody's seen the movie Demolition Man, just whatever it evolved to, like waving hands like this in front of people, that's what we're going to do from now on. I want to thank you for coming. So if you're not familiar with America's Future Foundation, we're a nonprofit organization geared towards developing the next generation of classical liberal leaders all across the country, but this chapter dedicated to here in Chicago. We're very excited to have you here with us this evening. If you're not on our email list, we want you to be on our email list. You can stop by and talk to me, or to Vincent, who's raising his hand there, or to Jeff in the back of the room if you're not on our email list. The good news is if you bought a ticket on Eventbrite, well, now you're on our email list, so we appreciate you for doing that. We're really glad that you could be here. This conversation with Philip Klein about his new book, Fear Your Future, How the Deck is Stacked Against Millennials and Why Socialism Would Make It Worse. Phil is the executive editor at the Washington Examiner. We're thrilled that he could be here. If you could please welcome Phil Klein. So, Fear Your Future, How the Deck is Stacked Against Millennials and Why Socialism Would Make It Worse, I believe is the leading candidate for nonfiction feel-good book of the year. So, we had Jonah Goldberg for an event last year and a couple other authors recently, and as I've discovered, people who've written books like to be asked, what is your book about?
Could you hear me? Is there, I don't know if this microphone is just for the TV.
For the TV broadcast, so.
Okay, so I'll try to, can you hear me? Well, basically what my book is it looks at the state of millennials, and I think that, as I argue in my book, that millennials in many ways are the most mocked generation in American history. And you've heard all the stereotypes about all of them thinking they're special snowflakes, and of living in mom's basement and chomping down avocado toast and guzzling mimosas and so forth.
Not all that's bad.
And I think that there's a sense of the older generation that they lived through a lot of things, and that millennials don't know what difficulty is, and they're the iPhones that everybody carries around have more commuting power than NASA did at the time that we went to the moon. So why are we hearing all these complaints? And so in my book, I feel like particularly on the right, you see a lot of people complaining about how millennials are just a generation of whiners. And so what I wanted to do with my book was present a different perspective. And basically, I think that millennials in many ways are getting a raw deal, and that they have justified anger toward older generations, particularly the baby boomers. And in my book, I basically look at two categories of challenges being faced by millennials. One has to do with the massive, unprecedented federal debt. And the second bucket of challenges has to do with the various costs of living and personal finance issues, the difficulty of building wealth, the expenses of healthcare and housing, and obviously colleges and the student loan that follows from that. And basically the way I see it is that there is this sort of clearly this new resurgent socialism that we've seen, and Bernie Sanders, it looks like, is not going to be the Democratic nominee, but it's very telling that his nomination was effectively stopped by people over 65 who wanted to put the brakes on a socialist. It's not from the younger people who are overwhelmingly voting for Bernie Sanders. And I think a big part of it is that he is addressing and speaking to a lot of these challenges that they're facing in their personal finances, which obviously I would argue government helped create or at least exacerbate, and that free market solutions could improve. However, people on the right are just saying they're a bunch of whiners, so why even talk about it? And another side said, we're just going to give you a lot of free stuff, and we're going to just wipe all these problems away. So clearly they're gravitating toward that. Of course, the problem is that if we go toward that path, the free stuff being paid for by government, it makes the first challenge I talk about, which is the fiscal challenge, that much worse. And so that essentially is the point of my book. It's sort of a rallying cry, and I hope that people will, one, resist socialism, and two, be more dedicated to actual reforms that look at the underlying fiscal challenges we face.
So could you drill down more on what you think are the unique challenges that are presented to the millennial generation? Because in kind of what you said earlier, that, you know, if you look at my grandparents lived through, and I'm a millennial, I'm on the oldest side of the millennials. My grandparents lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War. My parents are baby boomers. They lived through kind of the tumult of the 1960s, the 1970s, stagflation, the Cold War. We live in what would seem to be a more peaceful and stable time. And I'm happy to recognize that there are a lot of social problems that I think we didn't anticipate kind of at the turn of the millennium. But what do you think are the nature of the unique problems that millennials are facing that kind of set them apart, and it's not just older generations complaining about the younger generations in ways that they always have?
Yeah, so basically, I think if we go back to the two groups of challenges and take those individually, on the fiscal front, it's pretty clear what is uniquely confronting millennials and all of the generations that come after them. And that is, there's a chart in my book which looks at the debt as a share of the economy going back to 1790, from George Washington through Donald Trump. And it's a share as a share of the economy, so it's effectively adjusted for inflation. It's a consistent number. And what that found is that the debt right now is higher than almost any point in American history. It's higher than the Great Depression, the Civil War, World War I. The only time at which debt was briefly higher than it is now was for a few years during World War II. However, World War II was a one-off event. We mobilized for the war. We had to catch up because we were a late entrant into the war. We pumped up military spending. And then once the war ended, we started paying down the debt. And by the time the baby boomers, who were born in the early ones in 1946, reached the age of graduating high school and college, the debt was a fraction of where it had been. But now, millennials, the debt is more than double what it was back then. And it's happening at a time where, coronavirus notwithstanding, we're at a time of relative peace and prosperity. Typically during times when you run up massive deficits, it's during times when you have an economic or national crisis. And that's been true throughout our history. But basically right now you're having it something different, and it's because of the massive retirement population coupled with the rise in healthcare costs. And so basically millennials are taking care of a lot more people for a lot longer period of time at a much higher cost than any previous generation. Their share of there's sort of this myth that, well, every generation kind of pays it forward, just as the baby boomers paid for retirees when they were in their working years. Now millennials have to pay for the baby boomers. But that's not really true, because one, the people are taking out a lot more than they paid in taxes over the course of their lifetimes. And two, at the time the baby boomers were in their working years, the Social Security and Medicare took up a much smaller portion of the actual budget. So we don't actually redistribute wealth in this country from the rich to the poor as much as we do redistribute wealth from the young to the old. And so that's sort of the debt aspect of it. And then you have the personal finance issue. And again, there, by objective metrics, there are a lot higher costs for millennials in a lot of different areas. For people who were graduating, in the baby boom era, people, let's say, were going to college in the 1970s, would, the sort of complaint of the baby boomers is, oh, well, back in my day, I worked a part-time job to pay through college. Yeah, that's much easier, back in the 70s when college is a fraction of what it is today. But now college on an inflation-adjusted basis has gone up several 100% since that time, and that's sort of no longer a realistic option. So you have a wave of people who graduated, many of them during the Great Recession. They had massive amounts of debt. Housing costs are a lot more expensive than when the baby boomers were coming out. It's about 10 times more expensive, the cost of a median home. And healthcare costs, even on an inflation-adjusted basis, have gone up 10 times since where they had been. So you have a lot of these sort of compounding costs, and we could sort of talk about government contributions to those. But regardless of who's to blame, there's clearly a lot of these different costs that are trying to juggle, and it shows up in statistics I point out in terms of the wealth that millennials have at a comparable age. Once you get into your 30s, if you look at that age group, the prior generations, baby boomers and Gen Xers, were able to have saved up more wealth at a comparable age than millennials have been able to.
To what extent is the Great Recession really formative in the behavior and the thought patterns of millennials here? Because I always find it interesting that, as I interpret things, whatever moment we seem to be currently existing in is always a moment of unfettered capitalism. And the explanation for the Great Recession, for whatever problems that we're facing at any given time, is we blame it on unfettered capitalism, despite the fact that our capitalism is quite fettered, as far as I can see. And that explanation informing where I think we'll drill down to in the future of this conversation about the acceptance of socialism. How formative was that experience of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009 to the way that millennials' life experience has gone since then?
I think it's sort of tremendously formative, both in the terms of, because of the way that compound interest works. When you enter the workforce, you could, ironically, you have the least amount of extra spare money, but that also is the best time to invest because you have more time for investments to compound and because you could ride out fluctuations in the markets. And that was if you graduate when it takes a longer time to get a job, or at least a longer time to get a decent job, then it's harder to start that process of investing early enough. So there is sort of a real ramifications. I think that there is also this idea of perception. If you look at, let's say, somebody who came of age and was graduating into the 1970s, and you see government price controls, and you see high tax rates, and you see all sorts of failed government bailouts and meddling into the economy result in the problem of double-digit inflation and unemployment, and traditional Keynesianism can't do anything to address that problem, then a lot of those people turn to Ronald Reagan. And their experience was that once he sort of lowered taxes and pursued different policies, that the economy got better. Whereas the experience of a lot of millennials coming into the Great Recession is, and we could do a whole separate event on the government actions that contributed to the Great Recession. However, in terms of the perception, the easiest explanation is you see a bunch of, derivatives traders and wealthy, big banks blow up the entire economy. They get bailed out and you're still struggling to pay your monthly bills. That definitely feeds into it. And at the same time, millennials who basically born, let's say, in the early 1980s, they were in children. The oldest millennials were children at the time that the Berlin Wall fell. Mm-hmm. So they didn't have the experience of watching before their eyes as adults the collapse of communism, of all of these socialist, centrally planned economies. And so I think that, on the one hand, they don't have as much of the negative association of socialism, and yet they also have a negative association with capitalism. So I think that makes them ripe for the message of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren.
So if you look on the cover of Phil's book, there is this gigantic red wave that is forming, and that is a chart of total public federal debt, 1964 to 2049. So projecting forward of just how much that's going to grow. And if you can see, we have books for sale for $10 this evening. If you want to get a copy of the book, I highly recommend that you do. It's a very good book. So you see the way in which the federal debt is growing. I, as someone who's around when the Tea Party movement happened, I, as an individual, am generally wary of populist movements, but it looked like it was going to be a populist movement that fulfilled that ancient libertarian prophecy of taking over the government to leave everybody alone, or trying to return to a sense of fiscal responsibility. And yet, less than 10 years after that happens, we're in a position where you have an entire new quote-unquote new strain of monetary thought that says that public debt doesn't matter as long as you're issuing it in your own currency, modern monetary theory. You have people like Rush Limbaugh, who is influential, saying that, it turns out that debt and deficits never matter. You allegedly have Donald Trump, it's attributed to him saying, people warning him about the problems of the continual accumulation of public debt, and his response to it was, when that comes to a head, I'm not going to be in office, so why do I need to worry about it? How do you get people to be concerned about a problem like this when, you're talking about trillions of dollars? And I heard a day or two ago talking about the coronavirus problem that, you have our brains when we hear statistics, when they're low numbers, especially less than 1%, we tend to round them down to pretty much nothing. And when they're high, like over 80%, we tend to round it up to 100% probability. When you hear 10, 20, $30 trillion, $37 trillion is Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan, when it seems like monopoly money, how do you get people to actually care about the consequences of that?
It's definitely a difficult challenge. A friend of mine, Megan McCardle, had pointed out on Twitter the other day that a lot of times movies will actually use smaller numbers that people could relate to. If it's like a bank heist or something, they're not going to make it like a $5 billion heist because people can't relate to it. They might think like 25 million is higher or something, or 500,000 even. So I think that there definitely is a challenge. We saw an example of this week where a tweet went viral and it ended up on MSNBC, where somebody thought that Bloomberg could give everyone
$1 million.
$1 million.
And to be fair, math is hard.
So yes, the innumeracy is a huge challenge, and it's something that people in both parties exploit. And I mean, as an example, I think that there's on the Trump tax cuts, I think that there's a valid argument to say, well, if we want to cut taxes, you should also cut spending by a comparable amount. I think that's a fair argument. And there's a sort of fiscal responsibility argument against tax cuts. But with that said, the Republican tax cuts were about $1.5 trillion, and Bernie Sanders wants to spend $34 trillion. And that one thing is something that we've paid for, and we have precedent for something along the side of one. One would mean that if you double the individual and corporate income taxes, you wouldn't come close to it, to paying for it. And people don't really see what the difference is. So Bernie Sanders could get up there and make it seem like, oh, well, instead of giving tax cuts to corporations, we could just fund Medicare for all. I mean, if you took all the corporate income, like, it wouldn't pay for Medicare for all. And so basically, I think that what I've tried to do, and what I tried to do in the book, is to try to relate it to things that people think of as big. So in other words, saying things like, if we don't get the debt under control, then just even to maintain it at today's current elevated levels would mean that you'd have to get rid of the entire Pentagon. Or, and so I think that people, could relate to it that way, that, it's, things that they think cost a lot of money. And this is always a challenge. People think that foreign aid and waste, fraud, and abuse is 90% of the federal budget. They don't want to believe that most of the budget is things like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. I mean, there's often a popular chart where they try to say that we spend all of this money on military spending, but they eliminate the mandatory side of the budget. So they look at discretionary spending, which is basically military spending plus different items that get appropriated by Congress each year. And so military spending was about half of that. But then you get to, if you include Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, suddenly it's a much smaller percentage. Sure. But people don't want to talk about the fact that we spend significantly more on healthcare than we do on the military, because it doesn't feed into their talking points.
Let's drill down on the socialism part of it as a response to all of this. How much of it do you think is an attraction by people, especially millennials, to socialism qua socialism? And how much of it is what I think are two separate but related phenomenon? One of them is socialism as an embodiment of a Bernie Sanders cult of personality, where I think what we've seen in the election results earlier this week, especially in Michigan. So Michigan is a state that Bernie Sanders won narrowly over Hillary Clinton, and that Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. And their first opportunity to vote for somebody that is not either of the two of them, they overwhelmingly went for Joe Biden. And I think what we learned is, man, people really did not like Hillary Clinton. And that it artificially inflated Bernie Sanders' appeal, but nonetheless, it created this sense in the left and the Democratic Party that there's this appeal to these socialist ideas. The second phenomenon is socialism less as an attraction to the economic arguments in favor of it, and more as a replacement for a kind of lost sense of meaning. I think millennials are feeling that we're maybe the most interconnected generation in terms of having Facebook and Twitter and being able to talk to people on the other side of the world, but we talk even less to people within our own communities. And socialism is this sense that, well, we're all in this together, and it gives them a greater sense of meaning. What extent do you think it is a representative of those two phenomenon, and is it really an attraction to kind of the fiscal promises being made under the idea of socialism?
So I think a few things. So on the first part, I do believe that it's true that a certain extent of Bernie Sanders' support in 2016 was anti-Hillary. However, I don't think that's true for the purposes of this discussion, which is where younger people are going. Because if you look at the shift of the voters in Michigan from Sanders, let's say people that were more inclined to vote for Sanders in 2016 and more inclined to vote for Biden in 2020, it was more white working class voters who were more open to union households, rural voters, suburban voters. They were all more likely to vote for Biden than they were for Hillary Clinton. However, younger people were still overwhelmingly supportive of Bernie Sanders. So I think for the purposes of our discussion, I don't really think that offers much hope. On your second point, I do believe that while I think that the economic issues that I've outlined, if you're staring at difficulty making your rent, you're staring at hundreds of dollars each month of student loan payments for as far as the eye can see, and somebody says, I'm going to get rid of that, that's a compelling message, I think, that's going to make a real difference in your life. However, I think that there is also this social aspect of it. I mean, when we did a podcast with you this earlier today, we spoke a bit about a colleague of mine, Tim Carney, wrote a book called Alienated America, and one of the things that he picked up on in looking at the 2016 election, and particularly the people who gravitated to Trump early on in the primary, not just when it came down to him versus Hillary Clinton, but when there were other Republican choices, what he found was that he looked at various measures of what sociologists call social capital or social connectedness. How often people go to religious services? Are they involved in things like little leagues? Do they go to bingo at the town and bake sales and all of these sort of community events? And what he found was that areas with more social cohesion tended to be less likely to support Trump, whereas places with much more social dislocation, where churches had closed, where there wasn't as much civil society, that they were much more amenable to Trump. And I think that there's a similar phenomenon, even though they're ideologically different, there's a similar phenomenon in the message and the appeal of Bernie and Trump. And actually in 2016, when they were both on the ballot in New Hampshire, which is an open primary, I did speak to a certain number of voters that were actually deciding between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And I think part of it is this idea of, they're both talking about the rigged system, that the elites are, conspiring to keep people like you down, and we need to take them on. Now, the targets might be different. For Trump, it might be fake news and the Washington establishment. For Bernie Sanders, it might be drug companies and the millionaires and bills. Yeah. But there is this sense of this cabal of sort of bad elites that are trying to keep you down. And I think that has more appeal in places where people are looking for some sense of community that's lacking in their daily lives.
So, as an older millennial, I am old enough to remember when George W. Bush, entering his second term, thought he would invest his political capital he won in re-election into reforming Social Security. And I don't know if you all recall this, but it did not work out very well for him. You also have, as you point out, some of the entitlement programs that we have. It's kind of hard to jump off of these trains. Even you had a kind of populist movement in favor of it in the Tea Party, which really didn't lead to anything like that. What kind of practical policy recommendations do you have if we're going to do something about this public debt problem? Or is the only way to deal with it kind of waiting for Stein's Law to kick in? And if you're not familiar with Stein's Law, it states that things will continue until they cannot. So do we have to hit a true crisis inflection point before we're going to actually tackle the problem of these enormously expensive public programs?
Yeah, so I think that there's two different questions. One is what should happen, and one is what's likely to happen. And I think, look, I mean, as I pointed out in my book, if I were writing this in 2011 where there was some semblance of agreement that the debt was a problem that we needed to deal with, I would have spent more of the book talking about solutions and how things that we could do to get past it. Whereas the book was, a lot of this book is spent relitigating and sort of reminding people and explaining why this is still an issue that, even though we've decided because of the political incentives to both parties to ignore this problem, why it hasn't gotten any better. But ultimately the solutions are easy enough. I mean, they're politically contentious, but effectively you're looking at some combination of either significant reforms to the programs to bring down the amount that we spend on these programs, tax increases, some combination of both, and you could basically look at, you know, different options along that spectrum. There, you know, Paul Ryan has, you know, his plan was aimed at showing how you could get debt under control without, you know, without having to raise taxes. If you were willing to raise some taxes, then you wouldn't need as necessary, you know, as drastic of spending, you know, cuts, and you wouldn't need as much on the spending side. But you have to have the kind of political will to do that, to get to that point. Now, in terms of the idea of Stein's law, I think that the issue is that the longer we wait to do something, the more difficult it becomes to do. So right now, we could have a civilized conversation about how to try to address this and try to balance competing interests in, you know, the trade-offs between taxes and spending. But the longer we wait, had we addressed this in the year 2000, it would have been easier than when we tried to do it in 2011. If we try to do it now, it's much harder than it would have been had we actually done something in 2011. And if we wait till 2030, it's going to be much harder. And the real difficulty is if something happens called a fiscal crisis, which is, the short version is essentially that at some point markets say, we're really getting nervous about all of this debt and how Washington doesn't seem to have any sort of plan to pay it back. We're skittish about loaning more money to the United States. That would, you know, and then the United States would have to pay much higher interest rates to keep borrowing money. And at that point, you end up in a really vicious cycle, because basically the only way to bring down the deficits to earn market confidence would be to do some combination of spending cuts and tax increases, only they'd have to be much more severe, much more sudden. And doing that in such a severe and sudden way would also be a drag on the economy. And when you bring down the economy, that in turn also hurts you and makes deficits worse. So it's a very hard cycle to get out of. And economists say that basically there's no magic number of debt that suddenly triggers the crisis. You can't predict it. All you know is that the more debt you pile up without a plan to pay for it, the much greater risk there is for something like that to happen.
Like going bankrupt suddenly, then all at once, yeah. All right, so we've reached the portion of the program where we have time for some Q&A. I get to run around the room and do my Phil Donahue routine. There's like probably 3 people other than me in this audience that gets that joke. We do ask that you phrase your question in the form of a question. And if you go on too long, I do reserve the right to interrupt you in the most awkward way possible. So with that, if you raise your hand, I'll come around to you with the microphone right up here in the front to start.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, no worries. I'll get another ticket.
Nobody saw that.
Thank you for coming to Chicago and sharing your wisdom here. My question is, what's the timeline for this? Is this during our lifetimes? Is that kind of fiscal crisis? Is it reasonable to say that that's?
Absolutely. I mean, look, as I said, we can't. I mean, if I could predict the exact timing of a fiscal crisis, I would probably be. Yeah. But so you don't know when exactly it could hit. But like what we're seeing with coronavirus, for instance, is just how quickly markets could turn. I mean, we were surging to record highs, and all of a sudden, once panic sets in and there's a lot of uncertainty, people just start selling off. And so it could happen really quickly. I think that what we do know is that basically, if you look, roughly speaking, if you look at public debt, which excludes the money that is exchanging between the Social Security system and the Department of Treasury and so forth, and it's just the debt owned by investors. Basically, it peaked at around 100% of our economy during World War II for a few years. And we're basically, in another 10 years or so, going to blow past that. And in another 30 years, it's going to be like 150% of GDP. So that, to put that in terms, that's if basically for a whole year, all of the value of the entire economic output in the United States was purely spent on paying down the debt, it still wouldn't get rid of the debt. And so I think, saying 30 years in the future, that sounds like a long time, but if you look at the way projections work, in 2005, which he mentioned when President Bush tried to do something on Social Security, he said that the system would be exhausted in 2042. That was in 2005, so you're talking about 37 years away. Now we're in 2020, and it's about 2032, 2033. So something that was within our lifetimes was 37 years away. It doesn't seem so long ago, 2005. Something that was 37 years away is now 12 years away. So the estimates could change, pretty dramatically.
So we've heard a lot about what's going wrong. There's a lot of things that are going right as well. Unemployment's very low. Things are still very cheap. Most consumer goods, other than education and healthcare, it seems like the areas that are going wrong are those that are heavily influenced by the government, heavily regulated, and things that are going very well are things where we have more markets. So why are we losing, and why are the socialists growing support among young people despite the evidence in front of their face?
Because nobody is presenting that evidence to them. And the problem is that, the subject that I've written the most about over the last 15 years has been healthcare policy. My prior book before this was on alternatives to Obamacare and free market healthcare. And Obamacare is a perfect example. If you want to talk about what it does to young people, is that basically you're saying that we want to cover people with pre-existing conditions. So the method to do that is to force younger and healthier people to purchase much more insurance than they want or need in order to pay for it, instead of thinking of a different way to do that. And there are a lot of different ideas for how to approach healthcare on a free market perspective, but what happens is a lot of people on the right hear healthcare and they say, oh, well, that's sort of not a cool issue, like talking about guns or cutting taxes. So that's just one of those wussy left-wing issues. So we're just not going to talk about it. and you say, I mean, I joke like that that if you were to say like at a conservative, gathering, we're going to appoint constitutionalist judges, we're going to protect the Second Amendment, huge cheers. If you say we're going to repeal Obamacare, cheers. But if you say we're going to equalize the tax treatment of healthcare and provide people with free market solutions, crickets in the audience, right? And so what happened was after the Clinton healthcare plan went down in flames in 1994, you look at the way that two sides ideologically behaved after that. The Republicans basically declared victory and said, we're done with the healthcare issue. The Democrats licked their wounds, liberal groups learned from their mistakes, they waited their time, and eventually they got Obamacare. Then Obamacare gets passed, Republicans talk about repealing it, they never coalesce around an alternative plan. They'd rather just jump on the daily headlines to criticize Obamacare than make an argument for a market-based solution. And so what happens? They finally get a chance to repeal and replace Obamacare. They have no plan. They have no alternative. So what happens now? The debate among the Democrats is now between creating a government-run plan that, it's either expanding Obamacare or going fully socialized medicine. And that's where it keeps going. And that is just one issue, but it's indicative of, if you go through housing, why aren't we talking about, the permitting and zoning processes that are driving up housing costs? Why aren't we talking about how student loans actually help drive up tuition? Nobody's making these arguments, and they cede the ground to the other side. And that's why those arguments win, because they're the only people that make the arguments. If conservatives and libertarians were as passionate in making arguments on these issues as they are arguing, let's say, about gun control, then I think that you'd see a lot more victories in these areas.
Is it also complicated because, like, jumping on the headlines of Obamacare, it wasn't just to criticize it from the perspective of free market healthcare, it was also to critique it as it's taking money away from Medicare. So it's like you're arguing against it from the left as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, too, is that they just would jump on any headline of Obamacare regardless of what cohesive argument they were making. So if people were complaining about high deductibles in Obamacare, they'd make that criticism, even though from a free market perspective, it actually makes sense for a lot of people to have higher deductible plans and to think of healthcare as health insurance as the way we think of other types of insurance, which is that it's going to protect us against financial ruin, but it doesn't necessarily have to pay for each and every time we do something. We don't have car insurance that pays for oil changes. We have car insurance that pays for if we get into a major collision.
First of all, thank you very much for coming to Chicago. Do you think it's possible to grow our way out of this crisis? If it were possible to, say, grow at 8 to 10% per year for the whole economy, do you think that would make a difference? And if so, what is preventing us from reaching that state?
I mean, I don't think there's any way that we could realistically grow our way out of the economy. First, because basically you're not going to see 8 or 10% growth in a developed economy. The only way that you basically would see 8% to 10% growth is if you had some sort of massive depression, and then during a recovery, because there's easier comparisons to the prior year or the prior quarter, you're getting 8 to 10% growth. But a developing economy that's starting up from a small place is in a position to be able to grow at that clip. But in the United States, where you have such a large developed economy, it's a heavy lift just to get to 3% on a consistent basis. Particularly, it's difficult to sustain it, because if you grow, even if you were to grow 8% one year, that means the next year the economy has grown so much that it becomes that much more difficult. You're trying to add to something that's already pretty big. So growing your way out of it isn't really a realistic long-term plan.
So I have a friend who's very, very fond of Bernie. He's really into, in particular, he's really into income inequality. He's my age. I'm a millennial as well. He basically argues that my generation is kind of screwed right now, and he thinks that the only way to fix this is to either elect a socialist, or he was part of the Yang Gang beforehand. Essentially, the government give millennials more money or take more money from older generations. I've tried to argue and see back to him with stuff. What would you say to someone that would argue stuff like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I basically argue, I mean, if you look at the individual solutions that the Sanders campaign is putting out, they're not realistic by any stretch of the imagination, and some of them don't even address income inequality. In some cases, they're actually the reverse. So if you take his plan, for student aid, his plan is to wipe away all $1.6 trillion of student aid. Well, including in that $1.6 trillion are people who have medical debt and who are lawyers or have other professional advanced degrees and are doing quite well financially. So if you're basically saying that to a lawyer who's making a few $100,000 a year, that here's a check for $100,000 paid for by taxes of people who couldn't afford to go to college, to me, that's not really addressing income inequality. It's actually shifting, arguably, money from working class people to pay off people to have huge payouts for the elites. It's effectively the larger, the more school you went to, the larger your handout was. I mean, you listen to some of these rallies, he talks about people that have $350,000 in medical school debt and so forth. And I also think that there's a distinction between people who take on undergraduate debt where basically you're 18 years old and every adult in your life is telling you have to go to college, versus you're a college graduate, you could get a job and you decide, I'd rather go to graduate school for whatever reason. Now, in terms of things like healthcare, I think that a popular talking point is that, well, all these other countries managed to cover everyone for a lower cost. And what I say to that is, yeah, let's look at other countries. Other countries have national sales tax. They have much higher taxes on the middle class. You can't have Scandinavian level social welfare with American level taxation. And that's sort of the false choice. He talks about how he's going to give people free healthcare without premiums, payments, deductibles. So no limits on the amount of spending that you have. He's going to give you medical, dental, vision care, long-term care. Well, guess what? He always talks about Canada. Canada doesn't cover all those things. Most people have supplemental insurance.
Yeah, and Medicare right now, you have to get Medicare Part C to even just get dental.
Yeah. So he says he's going to give that for free. Most socialized systems actually don't provide dental care. The French system and a lot of other systems have some form of payments for, if you want to go to a doctor, you have to pay some money, so it's not free. The other thing he never talks about is he always talks about how we're going to, pay for all of this because we're going to save money by going after insurers and drug companies, right? Well, guess what? So drug companies, prescription drugs are 9% of our budget, of the amount that we spend on healthcare. 20% of it is doctors, 33% is hospitals. If you were to be serious about saying we want to bring our healthcare spending in line with other countries, then you have to go after doctor and hospital spending, right? In the United States, doctors make 2 to 5 times more than what they make in Europe. When's the last time you heard a Bernie speech in which he says, we're going to go after the doctors and hospitals? He never says it because people like their doctor, right? The drug companies are these sort of evil, faceless corporations, the doctors you know. And so if we want to have a conversation about socialized medicine, yes, let's talk about it, but let's have a realistic conversation about the actual trade-offs and decide if we rationally want to accept those trade-offs.
Hi, thanks for coming. I just have one question that might lead to sort of a dark note here, but I feel like alarmist rhetoric has tremendous currency nowadays, especially in the millennial generation, my generation. Whenever they hear sort of a policy proposal, it's usually compared to how many people will die is attached to it. In the event of financial ruin, how many people will die? Like, what does American society look like in the fallout of like a financial catastrophe for the country? Like, I think that would be a great point for us to make, and people in our groups, our peers who see the world in that from that lens, to say like, this is the effect. This is how many people will die if there's a fallout in American like financial systems.
What's the impact on people?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean,
Not literally dying, but like, what does American society and culture look like after that?
well, I mean, a few things. I mean, I think that on your that point, I mean, I've actually written a lot of things that are critical of some of these mortality studies, and there are a lot of flaws in these studies saying that health insurance, you know, if you don't have insurance, you're more likely to die and so forth. There's a lot of methodological problems with it. But some of the points that I like to make, and I do in my book, is things such as they always talk about, well, why can't we do big things like go to the moon or, you know, build the, you know, interstate highway system? And what was the debt to you know, what was our spending on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security when we built the interstate highway system, right? In the 50s, we didn't have Medicare, we didn't have Medicaid, we didn't have Obamacare. Social Security was in its infancy. There were a lot more people paying into it than accepting benefits, and yeah, at that time, we were able to do that. If you want your Green New Deal and you want high-speed rail and you want to spend all these things, I mean, Obama came out with a speech, you know, one of his State of the Unions, the theme was, we're America, we do big things, we go to the moon, and we do all these, we could do big things. But the reason why we can't do these big initiatives that AOC and all these people talk about is that we can't even pay for what we're doing now. And I think that that's one message that I talk about, is it basically forecloses everything else.
Is it worth pointing out as well that in some of these cases, even if we are capable of putting a man on the moon, it doesn't mean we can turn lead into gold. Like, there are still things that are physically, literally impossible, even if we were able to put a man on the moon.
Yeah. I mean, I did a post once where I went through, because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has this whole riff on, well, this is our moonshot, and this is, and I sort of compare, this is our New Deal and so forth, and I compared the spending on the Green New Deal to the extent that you could even estimate some of the stuff in that document. And you compare it to, I mean, we spent a very small amount of money on, relatively speaking, on sending a man to the moon. There were things that were physically possible based on the physics that existed at the time that we had to figure out, but it was possible to get the man to the moon. what she's talking about is like suddenly, oh, well, if we sent a man to a moon, we could turn America to being completely zero carbon within 10 years. And oh, by the way, we're not going to have any nuclear power, which every climate expert says we're going to have to double to meet climate goals by 2050. You know, so so you sort of get at that.
I know you mentioned that you think an issue with our generation is that we never have seen anything kind of like the Berlin Wall, that kind of a thing. But to what extent do you think education plays? Because I know for me, growing up, a lot of the things I was taught, I was really never taught about, you know, the deficit and healthcare and that kind of a thing. And a lot of things we were taught were a lot of far left ideology. To what extent do you think that also plays in kind of the millennial mindset that we have today?
I think it's a big problem, and it's not easy to address. I think a lot of people I think it takes effort to challenge the sort of what people are taught educationally. You either have to be getting it from home and, you know, have a parent that's of a different political persuasion that teaches you something else, or somehow you have to come to it by yourself, or you have to be very questioning and skeptical. But it is a problem, and I think that that's another ground that I think a lot of conservatives and so forth have ceded to the left. And it's one of those things that's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that a lot of conservatives view academia as a sort of wasteland, and if you're a college professor, you're just essentially useless, and you're just sort of trying to get tenured and you're not doing anything. So I think that the conservatives are probably more likely to go into careers that they see as more practical, or that they're trying to, you know, make money or so forth. They're less likely to pursue a sort of passion career in something like academia. And as a result of that, you get fewer conservatives or libertarians in academia. And then because of that, they become these cloisters places where it becomes much more difficult to be the lone conservative or libertarian on a faculty. And so I think that there has to be more of a mass movement, just like you had in terms of the federal judiciary, where you have the Federalist Society, which made a huge effort over decades to sort of nurture young legal minds and groom them so that they could eventually be in the position to be appointed to, you know, district, appellate, and Supreme Court positions. And I think you probably need something kind of akin to that for academia.
We have time for one or two more questions.
So, as a Gen Xer, I'm glad there's this fight between boomers and millennials, but I'm going to take the
Like being left out of that one, yeah.
yeah, I'm going to take the millennial side since I'm kind of outnumbered here. It seems to me boomers actually did benefit a great deal from government spending in terms of education. You know, when they were going to college education was incredibly subsidized. Now it was by the state governments, and as loans became available, the state governments pulled back, but now the students have that debt. You know, boomers grew up in houses financed by the GI Bill. You know, there were rent control laws. So there was all of this, what we call socialism now, that the boomers benefited from. Is it realistic now for them to say to millennials, you're on your own? Like, we did it on our own, even though everything you're asking for, or a lot of things you're asking for, we had? Or do we need to get used to the idea that we're going to have to pick up some of those costs that the boomers benefited from? Or is there a way to shift it back to the state government?
I mean, I think that one way to do it would be for people who are, you know, boomers to be less resistant to various reforms and entitlement reforms. that would put the country on a stable trajectory. And then maybe we could have a debate over what you do to make, to relieve burdens on millennials, which I think that there's a lot you can do on the regulatory front that wouldn't require massive influxes of spending. But I think that the best contribution that boomers could make is to just basically realize that if basically we go, in the coming years, the boomers are aging out of the workforce. So it's basically they came into the workforce when the World War II debt was largely paid off. They ran up a massive debt, and then they exit the workforce and are just collecting, are net collectors at the time when people are growing up. And I do think that imbalance has to be, and there are a lot of cultural, lifestyle choices that they made. So for instance, one of the counter arguments to the idea that housing costs have gone up is that houses are much bigger than they used to be. So if you look at it from a square footage perspective, then housing prices haven't actually gone up that much. However, if you're looking for a house, you want to have an option of maybe you want to have a 2-bedroom house, right? You might not want 6 bedrooms or nothing, right? And so because of the baby boomers, the average square footage per person is double what is now than it was in the 70s. We don't need that much space. And so I think that there were a lot of decisions that they made without thinking of the younger generation. So I think that if they are willing to be more susceptible, accepting of various changes that might affect their retirement benefits, I think that would go a long way.
One more question. We have time for one more question.
How earnest is Bernie Sanders in his endeavors, and how much of it do you think is him having a thirst for power or some ulterior motive?
I think it's pretty earnest. If I have plenty of criticisms of Bernie Sanders, but I think that he means it. If you look at a few weeks ago when we had this cycle where there were all sorts of clips of him praising Fidel Castro. In one of them, in the 1980s, he talks about how when he was a college student, watching the 1960 Nixon and JFK debate, that at the time he was a huge enthusiast and excited about the Cuban Revolution. So he said that when he heard the JFK and Nixon trying to argue with each other to see who would be tougher on Cuba, he had to leave the room and almost throw up, right? So then on 60 Minutes, a few weeks ago, he praises Cuban literacy programs. So that's just from talking too much, by the way. But so basically you have a 60-year period by his own account where he was really enamored with the Cuban Revolution. So to me, that points to somebody, he's not, talking about how much he admires Fidel Castro because it makes political sense, right? He's doing it because maybe he actually does. Yes, right? He's not doing that to win votes in Florida. I think he legitimately believes that.
Round of applause for Phil Klein.